Well, your moms are just upset. They're probably all on their periods or something.
Mr. Garrison, Wendy and I think that was a sexist statement.
Well, I'm sorry, Wendy, but I just don't trust anything that bleeds for 5 days and doesn't die.
Mr. Garrison is the most offensive character on South Park, which itself is one of the most offensive shows on TV. He's sexist, racist, psychopathic, a criminal, a sex offender, an asshole. He's also literally Donald Trump, and you know, people seem to find him pretty offensive, but we'll get to that later in this video. The point is that when it comes to potentially pissing people off, Mr. Garrison's pretty much got every other character on the show beat. But what's interesting about him is that on paper, you'd think it'd be the exact opposite, because a lot of the qualities that apply to Mr. Garrison also apply to every lame Disney movie trying to cram as much inclusivity as they can into everyone else's ass. I mean, seriously, think about it. He's a gay man that had an arc in the show about learning to accept himself and come out of the closet. He was a pioneer in the trans movement, which itself takes a progressive perspective on what gender even means. And he's a school teacher for young kids, which doesn't really mean much, but it sure does sound nice. Yet in spite of all of these things, he somehow manages to be more offensive than any other citizen in all of South Park. And I think that makes him one of the most unique characters on the show. So with that in mind, I think it'd be cool to see how someone like Mr. Garrison sees the world. See how his mind works. And I'm gonna do that by examining his values. Because I think the key to understanding Mr. Garrison is to understand the core values that drive his behavior. And since Mr. Garrison is Mr. Garrison, that means we gotta start with sex.
Garrison, you remember what happened to the wounded pigeon you were supposed to take care of?
Oh, come on, you all know that pigeon was a total slut.
Long before Garrison would become the President of the United States, and even before he became the insatiable whore we all know and love today, he was still always crazy about sex. Well, almost always. Technically, the first time he's ever shown to be sexual doesn't happen until episode 5. But the seed was there, and eventually it grew to become one of the most important influences on Garrison's character. Now in season 1, we only get small glimpses into his sexual exploits because for the first 4 seasons he was in the closet, which meant that our exposure to Garrison's sexual nature usually came in the form of him overcompensating for his gayness by pretending to like women.
Yeah, I'll tell you boys, women can kill. Poontang's expensive. That's why when it comes to chicks, I just screw them and leave them. I say, get out of my bedroom, Poontang, before you suck my life dry.
This early version of Garrison is easily him at his most repressed, but even still, he's portrayed as a pervert. And let's just say that his freaky side is usually when he's doing something that's, oh, I don't know, let's call it unsavory. Like the time he tries to trick Chef and Cartman's mom into a threesome, or the time he most definitely f***ed Cartman's pet pig, or the time he tried to meet up with a minor in the Namble episode, but it ended up being Cartman.
Good thing you guys came. This little boy was trying to have his way with me. Nice try, buddy. We monitored your little online chat. Now you're coming with us. No!
Yeah, even in those early days, Garrison will f*** pretty much anything. But of course, that stuff mostly happened behind closed doors. We didn't get to see it, it was more implied. What we did get to see were his romantic relationships, which were primarily expressed through his alternative identities, Mr. Hat and Mr. Twig. Because the only way he could have fulfilling relationships at the time was by dating extensions of himself. And yes, I am aware that both puppets are arguably sentient.
Wow, what a daring rescue! Mr. Hat! Mr. Hat saved us, Chef!
How the hell did he reach the gas pedal?
But for the sake of this video, we're gonna focus on how they act as an extension of Mr. Garrison because that's just easier. In those first 4 seasons, the puppets played a crucial role in how he expressed his deviant sexual nature, particularly Mr. Hat. In my opinion, using the puppets in this way instead of just quietly hiding in the closet comes from his intense need to express himself sexually. And I say need because sex is something that Mr. Garrison values so much that it drives almost all of his behaviors. But the puppets aren't even the only examples of Garrison expressing himself while denying reality. For example, he also wrote an erotic novel titled The Valley of Penises, which was incredibly gay, but he justifies it as a novel intended for women readers.
This is what we in the book publishing business like to call gay. Really, really gay.
You think women care about the details of female anatomy? Hell no! Women want to read about big, powerful schlongs!
But as we all know, this version of Garrison doesn't last very long, because by the midway point of season 4, he finally faces his demons and comes out of the closet, which serves as the first major turning point in his character. Once he's out of the closet, it brings on an era that I like to call the flourishing gay years of Mr. Garrison, which last from about season 5 to season 8. And as you might expect, once Garrison comes out of the closet, his general behavior starts to change accordingly. For one, he stops being homophobic, probably because now that he recognizes himself as gay, he doesn't feel the need to hate on gay people anymore. And while I know that's an actual phenomenon that happens with homophobic people who are secretly gay, Garrison's case is a little bit different, but we'll talk about that later in this video. But the other major change is that he gets significantly less sexist towards women after he comes out. And I'm not saying that he completely stops being sexist, but once he stops trying to act straight and shifts his focus onto men, he becomes noticeably less vocal about women in general, which shows that at least a part of his sexism was a byproduct of his internalized homophobia, most likely because he thought that being sexist would make him seem more straight. Now these might seem like small changes, but I would say that given how his character was portrayed prior to coming out, they feel like major advancements, because he goes from being a repressed pervert to an openly gay whore that makes his identity loud and clear. Like seriously, from season 5 onwards, Garrison is constantly doing something gay, erotic, or that draws attention to his sexuality. Whether that be through his relationship with Mr. Slave, his attempts at picking up the men of South Park, or even just his ability to say the word f*** without getting censored.
Hey there, shitty fag, shitty fag, how do you do?
Now this is probably the era where Mr. Garrison is the most likable to the other citizens of South Park. He's gay, he's happy, and he doesn't really get overly invested in what other people are doing. But Garrison's character development doesn't end there, because for Garrison, coming out doesn't end with being gay. At the very start of season 9, he suddenly transitions into being a woman, and with that transition comes the next evolution in his personality, Miss Garrison. As a woman, Miss Garrison is kind of like a combination of the character's early years and the flourishing gay years. Her sexual freedom is still intact, but now that they're considered straight again, the homophobia comes back too.
I'm not gay, I'm a woman.
Oh, Jesus Christ!
Oh, so is that it? You're just gonna walk out? You men are all alike. Go ahead and find somebody who doesn't have a vagina, you fag!
This fits perfectly in line with Garrison's tendency to hate those who are different from him, which, again, I'll dive into more later in this video. But what's interesting about Miss Garrison is that the transition seems to come out of nowhere. And while the motivation is never truly explained, it does affect their interactions with the rest of society. In the span of just a few short years, Garrison goes from being a gay man, to being a straight woman, to being a lesbian, and then back to being a gay man. And with each of these transformations, Garrison is constantly changing his stance on both sexuality and gender. As a gay man, he's no longer homophobic, but as a straight woman, he is. But then as a gay woman, he drops the homophobia again, only to become transphobic when he goes back to being a gay man.
Because the key difference between men and women is that women can have babies. If you can't have babies, then you're a man.
12 seconds later.
My wife had ovarian cancer, so she can't have babies. Well, then get an AIDS test, Thompson, because your wife's a dude. F it.
So what does this all mean? Well, I think that it means that the evolution of his character is primarily driven by his relationship to sex and gender. And that's why sex is such an important value to examine when discussing the psychology of Mr. Garrison. Because ultimately, it's the leading cause of change in how he interacts with the rest of the world. In fact, I'd say it's the only thing that gets him to change anything about himself at all. But while sex is a pathway to change for him, he also has a different value that prevents him from changing. And that's how he views society. Now, do I start this section with a nice, catchy thesis statement, or do I just roll the clip of Garrison doing the Garrison thing? I think you know which one I'm gonna go with.
Don't you see? If you get rich selling these homes, then there will still be rich people in South Park.
Yeah, you'd become what you hate. Well, yeah, but at least I got rid of all those damn
Garrison hates a lot of people. I know we talked about the homophobia and his feelings towards women, but those are really just the tip of the iceberg, because deep down, what Garrison really thinks is that anyone who isn't like him is in some way inferior. And that's made pretty evident early on through Mr. Hat, who not only represents his repressed gay side, but also his repressed racist side.
White power! White power!
Mr. Garrison, you're a Klan member?
No, but Mr. Hat is. White power! White power! Oh, you're such a racist bastard, Mr. Hat.
Whether it's a difference of race, gender, or ethnicity, Garrison is pretty consistently opposed to anyone who is different from him having a major influence on his home, because he doesn't like anything that doesn't fit with his rigid idea of what America should be. That's why he's always trying to get rid of all the immigrants in South Park.
Yes, Mr. Garrison.
Could we get rid of all the Mexicans?
No, Mr. Garrison, we cannot get rid of all the Mexicans.
Rats.
Now, Garrison is an extremely conservative person. In fact, I'd say that this section is really about the umbrella of ultra-conservative values that Garrison holds. But I don't just mean conservative in a political sense, I mean it like the literal definition of the word conservative, to have an aversion to change. That kind of defines how Garrison interacts with the rest of society. He's almost completely and blindly resistant to anything that challenges his rigid idea of what the world should be. But here's the thing. In a general sense, conservatism is actually very useful. We need people who push back against change and uphold traditions, because sometimes change can lead us in the wrong direction. So by having groups on both sides of the spectrum, we can better regulate how we evolve as a society. We can have our cake and eat it too. But Garrison is not a regular conservative person, because his views are so rigid that he is resistant to basically all forms of change, which not only causes him to have a nationalistic perspective of America, but is also why his character never changes in any way outside of his relationship to sex and gender, because his values are too conservative to allow it. And I know you might be thinking, well, what about the Trump stuff? Isn't that a character evolution that happened as a result of his extremely conservative values? And to that I say, is it? Because in my opinion, the Trump era of Mr. Garrison doesn't actually result in a change to his character at all. Sure, it leads him to new opportunities and it advances his role in the show, but when it comes to who he is as a character, it just reinforces what was already there. A man who stands against anyone that isn't like him. If you map out how Garrison became president, you can clearly see how it's entirely rooted in him doubling down on his extreme conservatism. It starts with Garrison expressing his hatred for the mass immigration of Canadians into South Park, which he originally puts forth in the form of song.
It took 43 presidents to make us stand tall, and just one black guy to unravel it all. Country gone!
And from there it spirals out of control into a full-on hate brigade. He gets rid of the Canadians in South Park. He even kills the Canadian Prime Minister, but then he just keeps going. Because now it's not enough to rid South Park of immigrants, he has to get rid of every immigrant in the country by f***ing them all to death, which is the promise that he ran on for his presidential campaign.
Them all to death. Let's make this country great again. Them all to death! And then I'm gonna take all the drug pushers in our country and I'm gonna them. Or you know those people in Syria, I'm gonna them.
Now, once Garrison is actually in office, he kind of largely stops acting on his hatred for others and kind of just coasts. Well, aside from when he nukes Canada, but that was really more Kyle's fault than anyone else's. And I think the main reason for why Garrison chills out once he's elected is because the true driving force behind his radical behavior is actually not his extreme conservatism. Because in reality, his conservatism is just a byproduct of something else. Something that he values much more deeply than sex or even his rigid idea of how America or the world should be. In fact, it's the same thing that causes him to lose interest in his presidency before he even gets it. And that thing that he values so highly above all else is himself. Oh yeah, baby, this is the big one here. I'm sure you all knew this was coming, because the most important value that Mr. Garrison has is himself. I mean, there's really only one way to put it, which is that Mr. Garrison is a massive narcissist. He's obsessed with himself, he has an incredibly fragile ego that he feels the need to protect at all costs, and he will happily use exploitative behaviors to do so. Now, part of me feels like this is just so obvious that I don't even need to provide proof of any of those claims. The show just straight up has more examples of Garrison's narcissism than Mr. Slave has gerbils up his ass. But just for fun, let's do it anyways. Because let's be real, you can never trust the YouTuber. We're all just crafty little trying to sneak in our secret agenda about South Park. So Garrison has a massive but fragile ego, and this is something that's established very early on in the show. And no, I'm not talking about how his relationship with Mr. Hat was really just a relationship with himself, though that would be a good thing to bring up. I'm talking about episode 2. Mr. Garrison tries to murder Kathie Lee Gifford, and his reason is that she beat him in a talent show competition when they were kids.
All I can say is, wow, we work where I am. Tonight I landed, pow, right in a photo too.
Garrison cannot cope with the idea that Kathie Lee Gifford is better than him, and so she has to die. Well, okay, to be fair, he does originally plan to outperform her through a school play, but when that goes bust, she has to die. And I'm sure you can see how incredibly narcissistic that is. But just in case you weren't convinced, take a look at how he copes with the loss through denial as a way of protecting his ego.
It wasn't fair. She had choreography. How could we compete with that? But now she's coming to South Park, and I know a way to make it all better.
And then later, when Wendy actually manages to talk him out of shooting her, Stan undoes everything by reminding him of her superiority.
Man, did she really throw her voice with 2 dummies at once?
The bitch must die!
Honestly, this episode is like the blueprint for Mr. Garrison, because it sets up the pattern he repeats throughout the entire series. He gets insecure, he pumps himself up or puts someone else down, and then he doubles down when challenged. That's why he acts so proud, because it's disguising how fragile he is. You know, like some Uncle Iroh type shit.
Prince Zuko, pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. True humility is the only antidote to shame.
Naturally, having such an egocentric mindset means that he's a very self-centered person, which is evident in his interactions with other people. Because no matter what the situation is, he makes himself the center of it. I mean, there are the times that he just uses the class to talk about his personal life.
Kids, over this last break, I met somebody, and I'm pretty excited, and we've been really enjoying each other's company, and you know.
I also love how after he introduces Rick to the class, he just sits down and stares off into space.
Okay, text me a lunch. Bye, Rick.
Or how about the time he wants Mr. Slave back, and he doesn't apologize, he forgives him.
I've forgiven you for walking out on me after I had my sex change, and I'm ready to take you back, Mr. Slave.
So you see, Garrison isn't just making everything about himself, he's doing it in a way that protects his sense of superiority. I mean, Darvo?
Deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. All right, let's role play. Hey, you blew up people's yards who were growing their own marijuana. No, I didn't. Are you joking, you psychopath? Now you're blowing up my yard. Jeez, you're really good at that.
He really is like the king of gaslighting. He'll lie, deflect, or manipulate situations to get whatever he wants. And that's just how he operates. He'll do whatever he can to come out on top with little concern for anyone caught in the crossfire. Like when he stops wanting to be president, he intentionally tanks his campaign instead of stepping down. Despite the fact that he's accountable at this point to like millions of people, but it doesn't benefit him anymore. In fact, it's the opposite. And so he tries to pretend like it never happened at all.
I don't know what you're talking about. I am a teacher. Okay, adjectives describe nouns, and there are several types of them.
Mr. Garrison.
What are some examples of adjectives you can give me for this sentence? Anybody?
You sold people a line, Mr. Garrison, and you have to make good on it.
The yellow ball, that's a good one.
And I could just keep listing things like this. You know, like when he tries to ban gay marriage because Mr. Slave is getting married to Big Gay Al, or how he's okay with using ChatGPT for his job, but not when Rick uses it for their relationship. I mean, both are bad. But you know, hypocrisy. And in the rare time that he hits a dead end or something better presents itself, he'll flip sides if he stands to gain from it. For example, he was firmly against atheism until Richard Dawkins showed sexual interest in him.
You're right. It's so simple. God is a spaghetti monster. Oh, thank you. Jeez, my eyes are open. Hey, everyone, I'm an atheist.
If nothing else, this shows how he'll abandon all of his other values if his ego gets satisfied, which is why he flip-flops so much on being homophobic, because if he values himself above everything else, then he can no longer hate gay people if he himself is gay. It's not because he gains empathy, it's because he can't stand to think of himself as flawed. This would also apply to his extreme conservatism. I mean, sure, he's from a small town and that obviously plays a huge role in shaping his views, but ultimately, it's more about reinforcing his own sense of superiority. That's the real thing that drives his racism and his sexism and whatever. I also think his narcissism is mixed in with his sex obsession, because we know that as a kid, Garrison was traumatized because his father didn't molest him, which I'm sure is the exact kind of thing that a psychologist would have a field day with. But it seems that even from a young age, he connected sex to his value as a person.
Was it that I was ugly?
Oh my God!
I wasn't good enough for you. Was that it, Dad?
Well, no!
Sure, you could go off and screw any whore on Ryland Street, but when it came to your own son, you were just too busy!
Now, we don't have access to what happened in Garrison's childhood, but it seems that growing up in a small hick town and being forced to repress who he really is has something to do with turning into the psychopathic narcissist that he is today. But also, this is just a cartoon, and I can pretty much guarantee you that Trey and Matt have never thought this deeply about Mr. Garrison or any of their own characters. I'm literally doing the Scrody McBoogerballs thing by reading way too deeply into a show that's just meant to be funny and offensive. So I'm just gonna say that I'm done with this video now, and if you have a problem with that, then I have only one thing left to say to you.
You go to hell! You go to hell and you die!